On the 3rd of September, 1939, a 25-year-old Englishwoman sat alone on a park bench in Munich. She was holding a small pistol. It had been a gift from Adolf Hitler. Her name was Unity Valkyrie Mitford. She had not been born in Germany, though by that point she had spent more time with the Führer than any other British citizen alive. She had been given her middle name after Wagner, and she had been conceived near a town in Ontario called Swastika, where her father once owned a gold claim that produced nothing. These facts sound invented. They are not. And they are not even close to the strangest part of her story, or the story of her family. Unity had 5 sisters. All 6 were raised in the same Oxfordshire countryside, by the same parents, under the same roof. None of them went to school. Their father thought educating girls was a waste of time. Their mother believed that most illnesses could be cured without a doctor. The household had no television, no radio for long stretches, and a father who claimed, with apparent sincerity, that he had only ever read 1 book in his entire life. Out of that house came a fascist, a communist, a novelist who reshaped English literature, a duchess who saved one of the greatest country estates in England from demolition, a woman who stalked Hitler across Munich until he agreed to have lunch with her, and one sister who did none of these things and instead raised chickens in Gloucestershire. I have spent a long time trying to understand how that happens, how one family, one set of parents, one nursery, produces 6 women who end up on opposite sides of the 20th century. The usual explanations do not hold. It was not money. It was not education, because there essentially was none. It was not politics, because the parents had no coherent political position until it was too late. Something else was happening inside that house. The result was 6 women who, between them, touched fascism, communism, investigative journalism, the inner circle of Adolf Hitler, the American Civil Rights Movement, and the restoration of Chatsworth. One family, one generation, every side of history. This is the Mitford sisters. Chapter 1. The House That Built Them. David Freeman Mitford was, by most available evidence, a man held together by contradictions. He had fought in the Boer War as a young man and come home missing a lung. He served again in the First World War with the Northumberland Fusiliers, where his brother Clement was killed at the Second Battle of Ypres. He survived. He inherited a title. And then he spent the next 40 years failing at nearly everything except fatherhood, which he managed to succeed and fail at simultaneously with a consistency that none of his children ever quite forgave or forgot. He was the 2nd Baron Redesdale. The title came with estates in Gloucestershire, Oxfordshire, and Northumberland, but almost no liquid money. The land was poorly developed, rents were low. He had 7 children, 5 servants, and the financial instincts of a man who once bought a gold claim near Swastika, Ontario, and found nothing. His neighbour on the adjacent claim, Harry Oakes, struck gold in 1912 and became one of the richest men in the British Empire. David came home with stories. He also claimed, apparently sincerely, that he had only ever read 1 book, White Fang, by Jack London. He said he enjoyed it so much that he saw no reason to risk disappointment with another. Sidney Bowles was his opposite in nearly every visible way. Where David roared, Sidney maintained a calm so steady it unnerved people. Her father was Thomas Gibson Bowles, founder of the Lady magazine and the original Vanity Fair, a self-made publishing baron. From him, she inherited an absolute certainty about how the world should operate. She believed children should spend as much time outdoors as possible. She believed doctors were largely unnecessary and that most illnesses could be addressed through diet. She believed formal education for girls was a waste of money. David agreed on the last point. Their only son, Tom, was sent to Eton. Their 6 daughters received governesses of varying quality who came and went with the kind of regularity that suggested nobody in the household was particularly concerned about continuity. What the girls learned, they largely taught themselves. They married in February of 1904. Sydney brought connections to London publishing and political circles. David brought a title and land that would have been impressive had it generated income proportional to its acreage. Together they produced 7 children in 16 years. Nancy in 1904, Pamela in 1907, Tom in 1909, Diana in 1910, Unity in 1914, days after Britain declared war on Germany, Jessica in 1917, Deborah, the last, in 1920. The family moved 3 times because David could never sit still and could never afford what he already had. He sold Batsford Park in Gloucestershire when the upkeep overwhelmed him. He bought Asthall Manor, a Tudor house beside the River Windrush in Oxfordshire, and this became the home the children remembered with real warmth. It had a stone barn converted into a library with a piano, and it was in that barn that the Mitford children discovered books, music, and each other. They invented a private language. They called their parents Mouv and Fav. They gave each other nicknames that stuck for decades. They called themselves the Hons, after the honorific that preceded their names as a baron's children, and held meetings in a warming cupboard beneath the stairs that they called, with total seriousness, the Hons' cupboard. Then David built Swinbrook House in a nearby village, and the daughters never forgave him. Where Asthall had age and stone and the sound of the river, Swinbrook was new and cold and designed by a man who did not believe in wasted space. The bedrooms were small. The girls were packed in together. The house felt, to its youngest inhabitants, like a punishment for something they had not done. But the real pressure was not the house. It was the combination of 6 extremely intelligent girls with no formal education, no obvious outlet for their energy, and parents who had given them everything except direction. That pressure was building every year, and by the late 1920s, it was about to find its way out. Chapter 2: The Novelist and the Beauty. Nancy was the first one out. She was 20 when the 1920s arrived, and she had been waiting for something to arrive for most of her life. Swinbrook offered nothing. London offered everything. She attached herself to the social scene that the newspapers had started calling the bright young things, a loose group of young aristocrats and artistic types who threw elaborate parties, staged treasure hunts across the city, and cultivated a style of irreverence that delighted the press and horrified their parents. Evelyn Waugh was part of it. So were the Sitwells, the Tennants, the usual constellation of well-born troublemakers with private incomes and public appetites. Nancy fit in immediately. She was funnier than most of them and sharper than almost all of them, and she had the advantage of coming from a family so genuinely eccentric that she never had to exaggerate for effect. She also had a problem that would define her 20s. She fell in love with Hamish St. Clair Erskine, a young man from a Scottish aristocratic family who was charming, well-connected, and not interested in women. He had previously been involved with her brother Tom at Eton. Nancy either did not know this or chose not to examine it closely. Their engagement dragged on for 5 years and produced nothing except what Nancy herself later called 5 years of humiliation and wretchedness. When it finally collapsed, she became engaged to Peter Rodd almost immediately after meeting him, and they married in 1933. Rodd was handsome and confident and feckless in a way that took several years to become fully apparent. The marriage would prove to be one of the more sustained disappointments of her life, which is saying something given the competition. What Nancy did have, and what no romantic disaster could damage, was the ability to write. Her first novel, Highland Fling, appeared in 1931. It was light, it was witty, and it drew heavily on the people she knew. A second and third followed. None of them made her famous, but they established something important. Nancy had found the instrument she would use to transform her family, and eventually herself, into literature. She was watching everything. She was writing it all down. The real books were still more than a decade away, but the habit of turning private life into public comedy was already fixed. Diana was 6 years younger and occupied entirely different territory. Where Nancy was clever and angular and relied on words, Diana simply walked into a room and the room rearranged itself around her. She was, by the near unanimous testimony of people who knew the family, extraordinarily beautiful. Not pretty in the way that passes without comment at a dinner party. Beautiful in the way that makes people behave strangely. The poet James Lees Milne, who knew all the Mitford children, described her as the most flawless woman he had ever seen. At 18, Diana was presented at court, and within months had secretly become engaged to Brian Guinness, heir to the Moyne barony and the Guinness brewing fortune. Her parents were initially reluctant. She was young. But Guinness was rich, well-mannered, literary in his own right, and clearly besotted. They married in 1929, and for a brief period they became the golden couple of London society. They had houses in London, Dublin, and Wiltshire. They entertained constantly. Their circle included painters, writers, and the same bright young things that Nancy moved among, though Diana occupied a more elevated position within it. She had 2 sons. She had everything the world she was born into considered a successful outcome. It lasted 4 years. In 1932, at a house party, Diana met Oswald Mosley. He was 45. She was 22. He was married, a sitting member of Parliament, and in the process of founding a political movement that would consume her life and define her reputation for the next 70 years. Diana left Brian Guinness. Her family was appalled. Her father refused to speak to her. Her mother was devastated. Nancy, characteristically, made jokes about it in letters and then worried about her sister in private. What nobody in the family understood yet, except possibly Diana herself, was that this was not a scandal. It was a defection, and it would pull other members of the family behind it. Chapter 3. The Blackshirt Wedding. Oswald Mosley was not what people expected. He was tall, athletic, a decorated veteran of the First World War, and one of the most effective public speakers in British politics. He had served as a Conservative MP, crossed the floor to Labour, then left Labour to found his own party. By the time Diana met him in 1932, he had just launched the British Union of Fascists, modelled on Mussolini's movement in Italy. He wore a black shirt at rallies. His followers marched through the East End of London. He was also, by every account, extraordinarily charismatic in private. Women fell for him routinely, and he expected them to. Diana was 22 when she decided to leave Brian Guinness for Mosley. She did not leave for politics. She left for him. The politics followed, as they tend to when a person reorganizes their life around someone with absolute convictions. Within a year of meeting Mosley, Diana had moved into a flat in Eaton Square and was effectively his mistress, though the word was not used in the circles they moved in. Mosley was still married to Cynthia Curzon, daughter of the former Viceroy of India, who was said to be devastated. Cynthia died in 1933. Some in the family believed the stress of her husband's public infidelity and political extremism contributed to her death, though this was never stated openly. Diana's family reacted as families of that class and period tended to react. They froze. Moseley was not welcome at Swinbrook, and her father made that clear without ambiguity. Her mother could not reconcile what she knew of Diana, the lovely, poised daughter who had made the perfect marriage, with the woman now attached to a man the newspapers were calling a British Mussolini. Nancy was torn. She disliked Moseley intensely and said so, but she could not sever the bond with Diana entirely. Jessica, still a teenager, was appalled for different reasons. She was already moving toward the political left, and her sister's embrace of fascism accelerated that movement considerably. The one person in the family who did not pull away was Unity. She was 19 in 1934, physically imposing, desperate for attention, and fascinated by everything Diana's new world represented. When Diana made her first visit to Nazi Germany that summer, Unity went with her. Together they attended the Nuremberg rally, the first since the Nazi rise to power. It was a spectacle engineered to overwhelm, and on Unity it worked completely. She came home transformed. But her transformation belongs to the next chapter. What matters here is that Diana brought her younger sister into that world, and that the consequences of that introduction would outlast both of them. Diana returned to Germany repeatedly over the following 2 years. She met Hitler through Unity in March of 1935 and found him engaging, courteous, and deeply interested in the British aristocracy. He seemed to believe, partly on the evidence of Diana and Unity themselves, that the Mitford family represented the views of the English ruling class. This was not remotely accurate, but it was useful to him, and he cultivated the connection. He provided Diana with a car for the 1936 Berlin Olympics. She became acquainted with Magda Goebbels and with Winifred Wagner, the English-born daughter-in-law of the composer, who ran the Bayreuth Festival and was herself devoted to Hitler. On the 6th of October, 1936, Diana and Oswald Moseley married in secret. The ceremony took place in the drawing room of the Berlin home of Joseph Goebbels. Hitler was present as a guest of honor. No member of Diana's family was there. No announcement was made in the British press. The marriage remained hidden until the birth of their first son, Alexander, in 1938. When it finally became public, the reaction in England was a mixture of outrage and confirmation. People who had suspected Diana's loyalties now had proof. The woman who had once been the most admired young wife in London society had married a fascist leader in the home of a Nazi propagandist, witnessed by the man who was then preparing to dismantle the peace of Europe. Diana never expressed regret about any of it. Not at the time, not during the war, not in the decades that followed. In a television interview near the end of her life, she was asked directly about Hitler. She said he was charming. She said he could be very funny. She was 93 years old, and she had not moved an inch. Chapter 4. 139 Meetings. The Osteria Bavaria was a small Italian restaurant on Schellingstrasse in Munich. It had checked tablecloths and modest food, and one regular customer who arrived most afternoons with a small entourage of aides and bodyguards. Adolf Hitler preferred it to grander establishments because it was familiar and because the owner knew not to make a fuss. He sat at his usual table, ate his usual meal, and left. In the autumn of 1934, an English girl began appearing at the restaurant. She came alone. She sat at a nearby table and ordered something small and waited. She was 19 years old, tall, blonde, conspicuous in the way that only a foreigner sitting alone in a quiet restaurant can be. The SS guards noticed her immediately and were suspicious. She came back the next day, and the next, and the next. For 10 months, Unity Mitford sat in the Osteria Bavaria, sometimes for hours, waiting for Hitler to acknowledge her existence. She had enrolled in a language school on a nearby street, close to the Nazi Party headquarters, specifically to give herself a reason to be in Munich. The school was incidental. Hitler was the point. She had decided she would get close to the German leader, and she simply did not stop until it happened. In February of 1935, after roughly 10 months, he sent the restaurant owner to her table with an invitation to join him. They talked for over 30 minutes. He paid her bill. She wrote to her father that evening in a letter that survives. "It was the most wonderful and beautiful day of her life," she said. She would not mind dying. She supposed she was the luckiest girl in the world. He was intrigued by a series of coincidences. Unity's birthplace was a town in Ontario called Swastika. Her middle name was Valkyrie, after Wagner. Her grandfather, the first Baron Redesdale, had translated the works of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, one of the foundational anti-Semitic thinkers whose writing Hitler admired. These facts, which were nothing more than accidents of birth and family history, struck him as evidence of something larger. He began seeing her regularly. She was invited to party rallies and state occasions. He awarded her a golden swastika badge and arranged a private box for her at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. The relationship, whatever its precise nature, was closer than almost anyone outside Germany understood at the time. Unity's recently discovered diaries, authenticated by historians in January of 2025, record 139 meetings between 1935 and 1939. She wrote each one in red ink. The entries are meticulous about dates and durations, but reveal almost nothing about what was said. Hundreds of hours of conversation produced only gushing adoration. The Führer was heavenly. He was in his best mood. One entry, from December of 1934, reads simply, "He talked a lot about Jews," which was lovely. Eva Braun despised her. She referred to Unity in her own diary with open contempt. Albert Speer, in his memoirs, noted something more revealing. Unity, he wrote, was the only person in the private circle who dared to discuss politics openly. Everyone else observed a tacit agreement to avoid the subject. Unity did not. She told him that Ribbentrop was the wrong man for the London ambassadorship. She offered opinions on which British aristocrats were genuine supporters and which were not. In a recorded conversation, he admitted as much. She and her sisters, he said, were very much in the know. MI5 took this seriously. Guy Liddell, the head of British counterintelligence, believed Unity's access to the German leadership constituted a genuine security threat. He recommended that she be considered for prosecution under treason laws. Nothing came of it. In the summer of 1939, a Jewish couple was removed from their apartment in Munich so that Unity could move in. She reportedly visited to discuss decoration plans, while the previous occupants sat in their kitchen in tears. By that point, no British citizen had spent more time in the personal company of Adolf Hitler than Unity Valkyrie Mitford. She was 24 years old. Chapter 5. Swastikas and Hammers. They shared a bedroom at Swinbrook. Unity, who was 5 years older, took one side of the room and covered the wall with swastikas, photographs of Mussolini, and cuttings from fascist newspapers. Jessica took the other side and pinned up a hammer and sickle and a small photograph of Lenin. Their parents, as far as anyone recorded, did not intervene. It is possible they did not notice. It is also possible they noticed and simply had no framework for understanding what their daughters were telling them. Jessica had been angry for longer than anyone in the family seemed to realize. At 12, she walked into Drummond's Bank in London and opened a savings account. She called it her running away account. She was not being theatrical. She was making a plan. The world she had been born into offered her no education, no profession, and no future beyond marriage to a suitable man, chosen by people who had never asked her what she wanted. Her sisters responded to this constraint in different ways. Jessica responded by deciding, very early, that she would leave. What pushed her toward communism specifically is harder to pin down. She read widely and without guidance, as all the Mitford children did. She absorbed left-wing literature from the library at Asthall and from whatever books she could find in London. She was aware, in a way that her parents were not, that the England beyond the gates of Swinbrook was a country of mass unemployment, hunger marches, and class divisions that made the distance between her family and the rest of the population feel obscene. But the clearest catalyst was probably the simplest one. Her sisters, Diana and Unity, had chosen fascism. Jessica chose the opposite. The Mitford competitive instinct, which Nancy had channeled into wit and Diana into beauty, drove Jessica toward ideological defiance. The person who crystallized everything was Esmond Romilly. He was her second cousin, a nephew of Winston Churchill, and he had already lived a life that would have been remarkable for someone twice his age. At 15, he ran away from Wellington College and published a magazine attacking the English public school system. At 18, he went to Spain to fight with the international brigades against Franco. He contracted dysentery during the defense of Madrid and was sent home to recover. He was reckless, magnetic, and entirely uninterested in the privileges of his birth. Jessica had been following his exploits in the newspapers for years before they met. They met in 1937, when Jessica was 19. Within weeks, they had eloped. The story made front-page news across England. The daughter of a baron had run off with Churchill's nephew to join the Spanish cause. Authorities at the highest levels were mobilized. The family was frantic. None of it mattered. Jessica and Esmond settled briefly in London, in a flat in Rotherhithe, in the Docklands, a world away from Bellevue Avenue or Swinbrook. Esmond worked as a croupier in a casino on the ground floor of their building. Jessica gave birth to a daughter, Julia, in December of 1937. Julia died 5 months later in a measles epidemic. Jessica rarely spoke of her afterward. She is not mentioned by name in the autobiography Jessica published 22 years later. In February of 1939, Jessica and Esmond left England for America. They threw a farewell party for their friends and sailed with almost nothing. They traveled around, worked odd jobs, and eventually landed in Washington. When the war began, Esmond enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. On the 30th of November, 1941, his bomber failed to return from a raid over the North Sea. He was 23. Jessica was 24, alone in Washington with their small daughter, Constantia, and she made a decision that held for the rest of her life. She would not go back. Not to Swinbrook, not to her parents, not to the England that had produced her and that she believed had produced, through its complacency and its class blindness, the very forces her husband had died fighting. She never spoke to her father again. Chapter 6. The Day the Family Broke. At 11:15 on the morning of September the 3rd, 1939, Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation by radio from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. Britain was at war with Germany. The broadcast lasted less than 5 minutes. Across England, families gathered around wireless sets and listened. The Mitfords were not gathered. They were scattered across 3 countries, and the news hit each of them in a different place, in a different way, and with consequences that would take years to fully arrive. Unity was in Munich. She had refused to leave despite repeated warnings from Hitler himself, who had told her over lunch in August that war was inevitable and urged her to go home. She would not. On the afternoon of the broadcast, she walked to the Englischer Garten, sat down, and shot herself in the head with a pistol. She survived. The bullet entered her right temple and lodged in her brain. She was taken to a clinic in Munich. Hitler visited her there and arranged for her hospital bills to be paid. He also arranged, through diplomatic channels, for her eventual transfer to a clinic in Bern, in neutral Switzerland. When her sister Deborah arrived in Bern to bring her home, she found someone she barely recognized. Unity had lost nearly 30 pounds. Her hair was matted. Her eyes were enormous in a shrunken face. The bullet was still in her head. Doctors had concluded it was too dangerous to remove. Diana was in England. She and Moseley had been under surveillance for months, and in May of 1940, both were arrested under Defence Regulation 18B, the wartime provision that allowed the government to detain anyone suspected of being a threat to national security without charge and without trial. Diana was taken to Holloway Prison. So was Moseley, separately. They would remain imprisoned for over 3 years. What made Diana's arrest particularly bitter within the family was the role Nancy played in it. Nancy had been in contact with MI5 and had provided information about her sister. According to reports that surfaced later, she told intelligence officers that Diana was far cleverer and more dangerous than her husband, and that she would stop at nothing to achieve her ambitions. Whether Nancy believed this fully or was motivated by a more complicated mixture of patriotism, jealousy, and genuine fear is impossible to know with certainty. Diana's youngest sister Deborah later disputed the account, saying Nancy's views of Diana as a national threat were inaccurate. The sisters did not discuss it openly for decades. When the war came, Tom joined the army. He had sympathized with Germany throughout the 1930s, had studied law in Berlin, and had attended Nazi party gatherings alongside his sisters. But he was also, when it came to the question of service, his father's son. What he would not do was fight against Germany. He served first in North Africa and Italy, and when the European War reached its final phase, he requested a transfer to Burma, rather than take part in the invasion of the country, whose culture he had admired since his 20s. Lord Redesdale, who had supported appeasement and spoken in the House of Lords in favour of returning Germany's colonies, reversed himself completely the moment war was declared. He was, beneath the eccentricity, a patriot of the most uncomplicated kind. He wrote to the Times in 1940, explaining that his only offence had been to seek a friendly understanding with Germany, and that while he had been proved wrong, he had been in good company. His wife, Sydney, did not reverse. She had written articles praising Hitler and defending National Socialism, and she held to those views after September the 3rd. The disagreement cracked their marriage open. They separated. David retreated first to the Scottish island of Inchkenneth, which he had purchased in 1938, and eventually to a cottage near Otterburn in Northumberland, close to the family's ancestral land in Redesdale. He lived there largely alone. In Washington, Jessica read about Unity's suicide attempt in a newspaper. Her husband Esmond was still alive, though not for much longer. She had no one in America who understood what the Mitfords were, or what it meant to learn that your sister had put a gun to her head over Adolf Hitler. She waited for word from the family. It came slowly and told her very little. By the end of 1940, the family that had grown up together in the barn at Asthall and the bedrooms of Swinbrook was distributed across prison cells, hospital wards, military barracks, foreign countries, and isolated Scottish islands. 2 of the sisters were behind bars. One had a bullet lodged permanently in her brain. One was on another continent, grieving a version of England she had already decided to leave behind. The parents who had raised them all under one roof could no longer stand to be in the same room with each other. whatever the Mitford family had been, it was not that anymore. Chapter 7. The Pursuit of Love. Tom was killed on the 30th of March, 1945, in Burma. He was 36. A bullet struck him during an assault near Sagaing, south of Mandalay, and he died 6 days later from the wound. His sister Diana wrote that his death was something from which she never recovered for the rest of her life. His father, already broken by the collapse of his marriage, retreated further into isolation. The memorial tablet in St. Mary's Church at Swinbrook describes him as a very perfect son and brother. He was buried at Tokian War Cemetery in what is now Myanmar, thousands of miles from the Oxfordshire village where he had grown up. Nancy learned of his death while finishing a novel. She was deeply grieved, but unlike her parents, for whom the loss ended all pleasure in life, she kept working. She had been keeping herself occupied for years. During the war, she had worked at the Haywood Hill bookshop on Curzon Street in Mayfair, a narrow, elegant shop that served as a gathering point for literary London. It was steady, quiet work, and it suited her. But the event that reshaped her life had occurred 3 years earlier, in September of 1942, when she met a free French colonel named Gaston Pawlowski at a London gathering. Pawlowski was short, not conventionally handsome, and by all accounts one of the most compelling men in any room he entered. He was a close confidant of Charles de Gaulle, had commanded Free French forces in East Africa, and spoke English with the kind of fluency that made his Frenchness feel like a deliberate performance rather than an accident of birth. Nancy fell completely. He became the love of her life, though the feeling was never equally returned. He was fond of her. He admired her intelligence and her company. He also had other women, consistently and without apology, for the entire duration of their relationship. The affair gave Nancy something no previous relationship had provided. It gave her a subject. In 1944, encouraged by Evelyn Waugh, she began writing a new novel. She was given 3 months' leave from the bookshop, and she used every day of it. The result was The Pursuit of Love, published in December of 1945. It sold 200,000 copies within a year. It made her famous in a way that her earlier novels had not come close to achieving. The book was a barely disguised portrait of her own family. Her father became Uncle Matthew, a bellowing, dog-loving, foreigner-hating country squire who hunted his children with bloodhounds and kept an entrenching tool in the cloakroom with which he claimed to have killed 8 Germans in the trenches. Her mother became Aunt Sadie. The Hans cupboard appeared. The private language appeared. The eccentric, isolated, chaotic childhood at a country house without enough bedrooms appeared. And at the centre of it, the heroine Linda Radlett fell in love with a French duke named Fabrice de Sauveterre, who was Pawlowski rendered in fiction with enough honesty that she did not bother to hide his infidelities, even in the novel. She dedicated the book to him. He insisted she use his real name. After the war, Nancy moved to Paris. The stated reason was to establish a French branch of Haywood Hill. The real reason was Pawlowski. She found an apartment at number 7, Rue Monsieur, on the left bank, close to his residence, and she stayed in France for the rest of her life. She wrote Love in a Cold Climate in 1949, a sequel with the same characters and the same country house world, and it confirmed her position as one of the most popular English novelists of the mid-century. She wrote biographies of Madame de Pompadour, Voltaire, Frederick the Great, and Louis XIV. She became, in her Paris years, a figure of genuine literary stature, though she would always be known first for the Mitford novels. Pawlowski never married her. In 1969, he married Violette de Talleyrand-Périgord, a duchess, without formally ending his relationship with Nancy. She learned of the marriage and absorbed it with the discipline she brought to most things that hurt her. She had always known what he was. She had chosen it anyway. Nancy was diagnosed with cancer in the early 1970s. She died on the 30th of June, 1973, at her home in Versailles. She was 68. Pulewski was with her near the end. So was her sister Diana, with whom she had maintained a complicated but unbroken bond, despite everything that had divided them. Jessica and Diana spoke to each other at Nancy's deathside. It was the first time they had communicated since 1936. Nancy was buried at St. Mary's Church in Swinbrook. The village she had spent her youth trying to escape was the place she came back to at the end. Chapter 8. The American Way of Death. The entire first print run sold out on the day it was published. 20,000 copies gone by the evening. The American Way of Death appeared in 1963, and it did something that very few books managed to do. It made people furious about a subject they had never previously thought about. Jessica Mitford, daughter of a baron, former communist, widow of a war hero, had spent years investigating the American funeral industry, and what she found was a system designed to extract the maximum possible amount of money from people at the worst moment of their lives. She documented everything: the selling techniques that placed expensive coffins on the right side of the showroom, because most buyers are right-handed and reach that way instinctively. The undertakers who told grieving families that embalming was required by law when it was not. The casket manufacturers who marketed sealed bronze containers on the premise that they would preserve the body indefinitely, a claim with no scientific basis. She called funeral parlors posing as a bereaved relative and asked about simple cremation without ceremony. Every one of them told her it was illegal. It was not. The book stayed on bestseller lists for weeks. It prompted a Federal Trade Commission investigation. It changed the way Americans thought about death, and more specifically, about the people who profited from it. Jessica had found her instrument, and it was not fiction or ideology. It was reporting. The same relentless attention she had once directed at escaping her family, she now directed at institutions that relied on people not asking questions. But the path to that book had run through considerable pain. After Esmond's death, she had rebuilt from almost nothing. She met Robert Treuhaft in 1943 through war work in Washington. He was a civil rights lawyer, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, and his politics aligned precisely with hers. They married that same year and eventually settled in Oakland, California. Jessica became an American citizen in 1944, partly because citizenship was a requirement for joining the Communist Party, which she and Treuhaft did together. They refused to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. They worked with the Civil Rights Congress. They lived in a world that had nothing in common with Swinbrook or Bellevue Avenue or the drawing rooms of Mayfair. They had 2 sons. Nicholas, born in 1944, was killed in 1955 when he was hit by a bus. He was 10 years old. Jessica absorbed the loss in the way she absorbed most things, by continuing to work. Her daughter Constantia, from her marriage to Esmond, grew up to marry the civil rights leader James Forman. Jessica's first book was Hons and Rebels, published in 1960. It told the story of her childhood and her elopement, and it presented the Mitford world from the perspective of the one who had rejected it most completely. Where Nancy had turned the family into romantic comedy, Jessica turned it into a case study of class and complacency. The book was witty and unsparing. It also marked the beginning of a parallel literary legacy within the family. 2 Mitford sisters were now published authors, working on opposite sides of the Atlantic, drawing on the same childhood, and producing entirely different accounts of what it had meant. She never reconciled with Diana. the estrangement that began in the 1930s when Jessica chose communism and Diana chose fascism lasted for the rest of their lives. They occupied opposite ends of the 20th century's political spectrum, and neither showed any interest in meeting in the middle. She did not soften her position with age. In interviews, she remained forthright about her family's failures, about the class system that had produced them, and about the particular moral bankruptcy of those who had admired Hitler and never recanted. Jessica died on the 23rd of July, 1996, in Oakland. She was 78. She had written 10 books, campaigned for civil rights, exposed an industry, and built an entirely new life on a continent her parents had never visited. Of all the Mitford sisters, she had travelled the furthest from where she started. Not in miles, though the miles were considerable, but in the distance between who she was expected to become and who she chose to be. Chapter 9. The Duchess Who Saved Chatsworth. Shortly before her wedding, Deborah wrote to Diana. She expected that she and Andrew would be terrifically poor, but she thought it would be nice to have as many dogs as one liked, without anyone telling them to get off the furniture. She was 21. She was marrying the second son of a duke, a man with no expectation of inheriting anything substantial. A comfortable life in the country with animals and not much responsibility. That was the idea. 4 years later, the idea was gone. Andrew's elder brother Billy, who had married Kathleen Kennedy, sister of the future American president, was killed in action in Belgium in September of 1944. Andrew was now heir to the dukedom. When the 10th Duke died unexpectedly in 1950, Deborah and Andrew inherited Chatsworth House, 35,000 acres of Derbyshire, and a tax bill that nearly ended everything. The 10th Duke had transferred his assets to Andrew during his lifetime, hoping to avoid death duties through a provision that required the transfer to precede death by at least 5 years. He died a few weeks too early. The exemption did not apply. Inheritance tax was assessed at 80%. The bill came to £7 million, roughly 300 million in today's money. Andrew sold 60,000 acres of land, gave Hardwick Hall to the National Trust, and disposed of paintings by Rembrandt and other pieces from one of the finest private collections in England. It took 24 years to clear the debt. Chatsworth itself was in poor condition. During the war, the house had served as a boarding school for evacuated girls, and the staterooms had been used as dormitories. Deborah moved in during 1959 and set about doing something none of her sisters had ever attempted. She built a business. She restored the house room by room, opened a farm shop in 1977, selling beef and lamb from the estate, added restaurants and gift shops, and was known to operate the ticket office herself on busy days. By 2002, Chatsworth was financially self-sufficient for the first time, covering its annual costs entirely through its own income. 600 people worked there. 650,000 visitors came every year. She had done it without a formal education, without business training, and without any of the literary or political ambitions that had driven her older sisters into the headlines. She had a particular fondness for chickens. Rhode Island Reds and Buff Cochins wandered the grounds freely, and she wrote about them with the same affection she brought to everything at Chatsworth. She also wrote a memoir called Wait for Me, published in 2010. In an interview with the Daily Telegraph, a journalist asked her a question. If she could have tea with anyone, would she choose Elvis Presley or Adolf Hitler? She looked at the interviewer with astonishment. Elvis, of course, she said. What an extraordinary question. Deborah died on the 24th of September 2014. She was 94, the last Mitford sister gone. Chapter 10. The Churchyard at Swinbrook. Pamela never made headlines. That was, depending on how you look at it, either her failure or her greatest achievement. She was the second sister, born in 1907. The poet John Betjeman fell in love with her and proposed more than once. She turned him down. She married Derek Jackson, a millionaire physicist who rode in the Grand National and was, by wide consensus among those who knew him, bisexual. The marriage lasted 15 years. After their divorce in 1951, Pamela spent the next 2 decades living with Giuditta Tomasi, an Italian horsewoman in the Gloucestershire countryside. She kept horses, grew vegetables, and was known among her sisters primarily for her expertise with poultry. The journalist Ben McIntyre, summing up the family, called her the unobtrusive poultry connoisseur. She died in 1994 at 86. No memoir, no manifesto, no prison sentence, just a life, lived on her own terms and largely out of sight. Unity never recovered. The bullet that entered her brain in the Englischer Garten on that September afternoon remained lodged there for the rest of her life. She was brought back to England and cared for by her mother, first at Swinbrook and later on the island of Inchkenneth in the Scottish Hebrides. She could walk, she could speak, but she was not the person she had been. Her condition was closer to that of a child. In May of 1948, swelling around the wound became infected. She was taken to West Highland Cottage Hospital in Oban, where she died of meningitis on the 28th of May. She was 33 years old. Diana and Moseley were released from Holloway in November of 1943. They were placed under house arrest until the end of the war and denied passports until 1949. When they were finally free to travel, they left England and settled near Paris. Diana lived in France for the rest of her life. She published a memoir, A Life of Contrasts, in 1977. She never disavowed her political views. In a television interview in 1989, she denied the Holocaust and spoke of Hitler with warmth. She died in August of 2003, aged 93, during the Paris heatwave that killed thousands across the city. She was buried at Swinbrook. Their father had died long before, in 1958, aged 80, frail and largely alone in Northumberland. Sidney survived him by 5 years. They never reconciled. The letters survived. Thousands of them, written across decades, between sisters who were scattered across continents and political divides, but who never entirely stopped writing to each other. Charlotte Moseley, Diana's daughter-in-law, edited a selection published in 2007 as The Mitfords, Letters Between 6 Sisters. The correspondence reveals something the headlines never captured. Beneath the fascism and the communism, beneath the prison sentences and the country houses, these were sisters. They used nicknames. They gossiped. They worried about each other's health and complained about each other's husbands. They were, in their letters, recognizably a family. 4 of them are buried in the churchyard at St. Mary's Church in Swinbrook. Nancy, Unity, Diana, and Pamela. Their graves are simple, close together, in the same Oxfordshire soil where they played as children when Atholl Manor was still the family home, and the barn was still their world. Tom's memorial tablet is inside the church. Jessica is buried in Oakland, California. Deborah is buried at St. Peter's in Edensaw on the Chatsworth estate, beside her husband. 6 sisters, 1 nursery, every direction the 20th century had to offer. And in the end, most of them came home. Chapter 11. What One Nursery Made. The usual explanation is that the Mitford sisters were products of their time, that the political extremes of the 1930s pulled people in opposite directions, and that a family like theirs, with its connections and its visibility, was simply caught in the current. There is truth in that. but it does not explain why 6 girls from the same house chose 6 entirely different currents. I think the answer is closer to home than history. Their parents gave them no education and no direction. They gave them a library and a barn and a warming cupboard and told them, in effect, to sort themselves out. That absence of structure did not produce passivity. It produced intensity. Each sister had to invent a version of herself from scratch, and because they were competing with 5 other people doing the same thing under the same roof, the versions had to be distinct. Nancy took language, Diana took beauty and conviction, Unity took obsession, Jessica took rebellion, Deborah took endurance, Pamela took refusal. None of them repeated another. The class they were born into expected them to marry well and disappear into the lives of their husbands. Not one of them did that. Even Deborah, who came closest to the expected path, ended up running a business larger than anything her father or grandfather had managed. Even Pamela, who wanted nothing from public life, chose a path that the conventions of her world would not have recognized as a life at all. What strikes me most, having followed this family from the barn at Asthall to the churchyard at Swinbrook, is not the politics or the scandal. It is the letters. Thousands of them, written over decades, across every divide that the 20th century could produce. A fascist writing to a communist. A duchess writing to a muckraker. A novelist writing to a chicken farmer. They argued. They judged. They occasionally stopped speaking entirely, but they kept writing. They could not leave each other alone. That is the Mitford story in the end, not the headlines, not the history. The fact that 6 sisters, who agreed on almost nothing and forgave each other almost everything, never stopped being a family. The nursery held.